The gun was already cocked when Timothy Whitaker pushed through the saloon doors, and the barrel was pointed directly at the woman who had, by every account he'd received, cost 3 men their fortunes, 2 men their pride, and 1 man his entire cattle operation. Maria Quinn stood at the center of the Dusty Rose Saloon in Laredo, Texas, in the autumn of 1882, and she did not flinch, not even slightly. The man holding the gun was Harlan Brace, a cattle broker with mean eyes and a reputation for settling debts in ways that the law tended to look past. His hand was shaking, which was the only thing keeping Timothy from drawing his own weapon immediately. A shaking hand on a cocked gun was the most dangerous thing in any room. "You cost me everything," Harlan said, his voice cracking down the middle like dry wood. "That land deal, the water rights, all of it. You knew what you were doing and you did it anyway." Maria Quinn did not step back. She stood with her chin lifted, her dark hair pinned under a dusty hat, her green eyes locked on the gun barrel with an expression that Timothy could only describe as controlled fury. She was wearing a riding coat that had seen hard miles, and a pair of boots that had clearly walked every inch of those miles herself. She was not beautiful in the soft, drawing-room way that men in parlors talked about. She was beautiful the way a thunderstorm was beautiful, the kind that made you want to stand out in it even when you knew better. "I knew exactly what I was doing," she said, her voice steady as a river stone, "and I would do it again." The room held its breath. Timothy Whitaker had ridden 4 days from San Antonio on the word of a lawyer named Gerald Fitch, who had told him over warm whiskey that there was a woman in Laredo who needed a business partner and that she was, quote, headstrong and costly, and had a habit of making enemies faster than most men made friends. Timothy had set down his glass and said that sounded like his kind of woman. He had not known, when he said it, how prophetic those words would turn out to be. He moved, not toward Harlan, not in a straight line. He moved at an angle, placing himself between the gun and Maria Quinn in a single fluid motion that covered the distance before the room had time to register it was happening. He did not draw his own weapon. He simply stood there, 6 feet and 2 inches of deliberate obstruction, and looked at Harlan Brace with the kind of calm that comes not from the absence of fear but from the decision to be larger than it. "You're going to lower that," Timothy said. Harlan blinked. "Who in the hell are you?" "Nobody worth shooting," Timothy said. "Which is more than I can say for the trouble you'll be in if that hammer drops." The standoff stretched for 10 full seconds. Then Harlan Brace lowered the gun, his face collapsing into something between rage and humiliation, and he turned and walked out of the saloon with the particular stiff dignity of a man who knew he had just lost something he could never get back. The room exhaled. Maria Quinn turned to look at the man who had stepped between her and a loaded gun, and her expression was not gratitude. It was assessment, sharp, unsentimental, and thorough. "I didn't need that," she said. "I know," Timothy said. "Then why did you do it?" He thought about it for a moment, honestly and without performance. "Because you were more interesting to me alive than dead." She stared at him for 3 full seconds. Then, for the first time, something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile, not yet, but the possibility of one. "Buy me a drink," she said, "and explain to me why you are in my town." Timothy Whitaker had arrived in Laredo 3 days before that moment in the saloon, though understanding how he came to be there required going back further than that. It required going back to San Antonio, and before that to the long, dry years in between, and before that to the particular kind of man that Timothy Whitaker had spent his whole life becoming. He had been born in 1851 in a small town in Tennessee, the 3rd son of a farmer who was better at dreaming than harvesting. When the war came, his father went with it and did not come back, and Timothy, at 12 years old, became the primary provider for his mother and 2 younger siblings. He learned early that the world did not care about fairness, that it did not reward suffering or good intentions, and that the only people who survived the hard years were the ones who learned to be useful in practical and irreplaceable ways. By the time he was 22, He had drifted west with the post-war migration of young men who had no inheritance and no prospects, but possessed an enormous capacity for hard work. He had worked cattle drives up the Kisham Trail twice, had spent 2 years as a surveyor's assistant for the Texas and Pacific Railway, and had eventually parlayed a talent for reading land and water rights into a modest but growing career as a land broker and negotiator. He was not rich, but he was solvent, which in 1882 Texas meant something. He had come to San Antonio on a water rights dispute for a rancher named Patterson, and it was there, at Gerald Fitch's law office, that he had first heard the name Maria Quinn. Gerald Fitch was a small man with enormous ambitions and a face like a worried mouse. He had described the situation in Laredo with the kind of relish that lawyers reserve for problems they are deeply interested in but personally unwilling to touch. There was, he explained, a piece of land southeast of Laredo that sat at the convergence of 3 separate water sources. It was not much to look at, but whoever controlled that land controlled the water access for 4 surrounding ranches and a growing farming settlement. The land had been tied up in a complicated series of competing claims for going on 6 years, and the woman who had most recently come into possession of the central parcel was named Maria Quinn. She was, Fitch explained with evident admiration and concern in equal measure, the daughter of a deceased Irish land speculator named Patrick Quinn, who had come to Texas in the 1860s and spent 20 years acquiring parcels the way other men accumulated debt. He had left his daughter an education, a fierce temperament, an intimate knowledge of Texas land law, and 7 different contested property claims, 3 of which were currently the subject of active litigation. She had enemies, Fitch said. She had 3 ongoing lawsuits. She had Harlan Brace, who believed she had outmaneuvered him on a water rights deal the previous spring, and 2 other cattle brokers who had similar grievances. She needed someone with expertise in land negotiation and water law, who could help her consolidate her position before the next round of hearings in December. The fee, Fitch said delicately, would be contingent on resolution. Timothy had asked what the downside was. Fitch had paused meaningfully. She is, by all accounts, exceptionally headstrong. She will not be managed or directed. Several men have tried to advise her, and she has, in each case, dismissed them for failing to grasp her strategy. She operates entirely on her own terms, and she is, it must be said, somewhat costly in that she expects competence and will not pay for anything less. Timothy had finished his whiskey. "That sounds like my kind of woman," he had said, and had ridden south the next morning. He had spent his first day in Laredo listening rather than talking. He visited the county land office, read the relevant filings, spoke with the local justice of the peace, and visited a hardware merchant who doubled as the town's informal clearinghouse for information. By the end of the day, he had a clear picture of the contested land situation and a grudging respect for the strategic intelligence behind Maria Quinn's series of moves over the previous 2 years. She had not been reckless, as her enemies claimed. She had been precise. Each acquisition had been calculated to add leverage to the next. The problem was not her strategy. The problem was that she had run short of capital at a critical moment, and Harlan Brace had moved into that gap with a competing claim that, if it held, would block her access to the largest of the 3 water sources. It was a good trap, and it had been set with the specific knowledge of her financial position, which meant someone in her inner circle had been feeding Brace information. That was the hidden motive underneath everything, the betrayal within the betrayal, the thing that Timothy had suspected before he'd even set foot in the saloon. He had gone to the Dusty Rose that evening not to find Maria Quinn, but because the saloon was also where Harlan Brace conducted most of his business, and Timothy wanted to observe the man before any confrontation became necessary. He had not expected to walk into one already in progress. Now he sat across from Maria Quinn at a corner table in the Dusty Rose, with 2 glasses of decent whiskey between them and the remnant tension of the last 10 minutes still crackling in the air like the atmosphere after a lightning strike. She was studying him with those green eyes, and he was studying her right back, neither of them pretending otherwise. "Gerald Fitch sent you," she said. It was not a question. "He mentioned your situation," Timothy said. "I was interested. He described me as headstrong and costly, I assume," she said. "He used those exact words. And you came anyway." "I came because of those words," Timothy said. Something moved in her expression, not the softening he might have expected, but a sharpening, as if his answer had confirmed something she had been testing for. "Most men hear headstrong and costly and they ride the other direction." "Most men don't understand what those words actually mean," he said. "Headstrong means you know your own mind and you don't apologize for it. Costly means you expect quality and you won't settle for less. Those aren't problems, those are standards." Maria Quinn was quiet for a moment. Outside, a horse clattered past on the hard-packed street. The saloon piano started up again, tentative at first, then settling into something with a slow, rolling rhythm. "You stepped between me and that gun," she said. "I did. I want to be clear," she said, "that I did not need rescuing." "I know that too," he said. "I stepped between you and the gun because I needed you alive for the business arrangement I was planning to propose, not because I thought you were incapable of handling it yourself." She tilted her head slightly. "That is either the most honest thing a man has said to me in years or the most clever." "Could be both," he said. For the first time, the possibility at the corner of her mouth became an actual thing, brief and guarded but real. She lifted her glass. "Tell me what you know about my land situation," she said, "and I will tell you how much of it is wrong." He told her everything he had pieced together in a single day of listening and reading. He laid it out methodically, the competing claims, the water rights structure, the legal timeline, the financial pressure, and at the end he told her what he had concluded about the information leak that had allowed Brace to position himself so precisely. She was very still when he finished. "Say that last part again," she said quietly. "Someone who knows your financial position gave Brace the timing he needed," he said. "It's the only explanation for how accurate his countermove was. He didn't guess. He was told." The color in her face had shifted, not to distress exactly, but to something colder and more controlled. He watched her process it, and he did not rush her. "I have 3 people who know the full picture," she said. "My lawyer, a man named Santos who manages the day-to-day operations at the land, and my banker." "I'd start with the banker," Timothy said. She looked at him carefully. "Why the banker?" "Because Brace's move required capital. A competing claim needs filing fees, surveys, witnesses, and Brace moved fast. He needed to know not just that you were short, but how short and for how long. A banker knows all 3 of those things." Maria Quinn set her glass down. Her jaw was set hard. "His name is Alderman Croft," she said. "He has been my father's banker and then mine for 15 years. 15 years is a long time to stay loyal," Timothy said carefully. "And people's loyalties can be purchased if the price is right, and if they've convinced themselves you'll never find out." She was quiet for a long time. The piano played on. Timothy did not fill the silence with reassurances because he respected her too much to do that. She was working through the implications of a betrayal that was personal as well as financial, and she needed the space to do it honestly. "What would you need," she said finally, "to help me fix this?" "Access to your files, your filings, and your financial records. 2 weeks, possibly 3. And the understanding that I work as your equal partner in the strategy, not your employee." "Equal partners split the outcome," she said. "I know," he said. She studied him again. "You're not afraid of losing." "I'm not afraid of much," he said. "But losing something I'd worked hard for would bother me considerably, which is why I don't propose arrangements I don't believe in." She extended her hand across the table. Her grip was firm and direct. "Timothy Whitaker," she said, testing his name. "All right, you have 2 weeks." He shook her hand and felt the particular charge of a decision made between 2 people who were, in that moment, exactly equal. The days that followed were the most intellectually intense of Timothy Whitaker's professional life. and also, though he would not have admitted it aloud at the time, the most personally absorbing. Maria Quinn's land office was in a low adobe building 2 streets back from the main thoroughfare, a space that was organized with a precision that initially seemed chaotic and revealed itself, on closer examination, to be a system of extraordinary logic. Papers were cross-referenced by date, by claimant, by water source, and by legal jurisdiction. She could locate any document within 30 seconds and could quote the relevant Texas land statutes from memory with the accuracy of someone who had not just read them but had argued them before a judge. She had, in fact, argued 3 of them before judges. She had won 2. Timothy spread his own knowledge across the table alongside hers, and they worked together with the concentrated energy of 2 people who had each operated alone for too long and had not realized it until they were no longer alone. She pushed back on his analysis constantly, not reflexively, not from pride, but because she saw things he missed, and she was not willing to let those things go unaddressed. He pushed back on hers for the same reason. Within 2 days they had developed a working rhythm that was efficient and occasionally heated and always honest. "You're wrong about the Johnson filing," she said on the second morning, pointing at his notes. "The survey date predates the competing claim by 11 days, which makes the easement valid regardless of the subsequent dispute." "I know," he said. "I'm not arguing the filing. I'm arguing that the judge who will hear this in December has ruled against easement claims twice in the last year, and you need to be prepared for that possibility." She looked at him with an expression that he was beginning to learn meant she was reassessing something. "You looked up his rulings." "I looked up everything relevant," he said. "When?" "Yesterday evening." She was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet he saw something that she didn't often let out, a kind of surprised relief, as if she had been waiting for someone to match her level of preparation and had stopped expecting it. "All right," she said. "Then we need a secondary argument that doesn't rely on the easement." "I've already started one," he said, and slid the relevant papers across the table. She read them without speaking, and he watched the small movements of her expression as she absorbed and evaluated. It was, he thought, one of the most beautiful things he had ever seen. Not beautiful in a way he could have explained easily, but beautiful in the way that watching something work exactly as it was built to work was beautiful. He realized somewhere around the 4th day, in serious trouble of the most enjoyable kind. He did not act on it. She had not invited anything personal, and she was dealing with the practical reality of a betrayal that was becoming clearer with each day of investigation. The trail led, as he had suspected, to Alderman Croft. The specifics were worse than either of them had anticipated. Croft had not simply tipped Brace to her financial position. He had been actively directing Brace's acquisition strategy for nearly 8 months, feeding him information in exchange for a percentage of the water rights that Brace stood to gain. It was a scheme of quiet, sustained treachery, made more painful by the years of trust that had preceded it. Maria found out the full extent of it on the 5th day, when Timothy laid the documented evidence in front of her on the table in her office. She read through every page without speaking. He watched her and said nothing. When she finished, she sat back and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. 15 years, she said. "Yes," he said. "He held my father's hand when he was dying," she said. "He was at the funeral. He called himself a friend of the family." Timothy did not try to soften it. Some things deserve to be sat with in their full weight. "What do you want to do about it?" he asked. She brought her eyes back down to the table. Something in them had hardened into a very specific kind of resolve. "I want to bury him legally," she said. "I want every transaction he authorized on my behalf reviewed. I want his arrangement with Brace documented and presented to the court. And I want Harlan Brace's claim thrown out on the basis of fraudulent interference." "That's a strong legal argument," Timothy said, "but it requires filing a new complaint within the next week to get it in front of the December hearing." "Then we write it today," she said. They wrote it together, side by side at her desk, with the afternoon sun coming through the single high window and laying a long rectangle of light across the paper. They worked for 5 hours without stopping. Twice he reached across her to indicate something in the statutes, and she did not move away. And the second time she leaned slightly toward him to read where he was pointing, and he was intensely aware of the proximity in a way that he kept carefully internal. She was aware of it too. He knew this because she was a perceptive woman and very little escaped her, and because once, very briefly, when their eyes met over a passage they had both just realized was the keystone of their entire argument, something passed between them that had nothing to do with land law. She looked away first, but she did not move back. They delivered the filing to the county courthouse the following morning, and then Maria suggested they ride out to the land itself, the central parcel that the entire dispute was about, because she wanted him to see it. They rode south from Laredo for 2 hours, through the particular hard beauty of the South Texas brush country in October, where the sky was enormous and the light had a quality of thin gold that made everything look slightly more significant than it was. The land around them was mesquite and prickly pear and live oak, and the occasional stand of cottonwood where water ran beneath the surface. The land Maria Quinn was fighting for did not look like much when they first came to it. It was a low, broad valley between 2 gentle ridges, dry-looking and scrubby in the way of all this country. But then she pointed out where the 3 separate water flows converged, 2 underground springs and 1 seasonal creek that, with the right infrastructure, could be directed to serve a significant portion of the surrounding range. And Timothy understood immediately why everyone wanted it. "My father bought this parcel in 1874, she said, standing at the edge of the valley with her horse ground-hitched behind her. He'd been trying to acquire the adjacent pieces for 3 years before he died. He knew what it was worth. He knew what it could do. And you've been finishing what he started," Timothy said. "Someone has to," she said simply. He looked at her standing there in the October light, looking out over the land her father had dreamed about, and the thing that had been quietly building in him for 5 days became suddenly and inconveniently specific. He wanted to know everything about her, not the professional details which he was already learning, but the rest of it. What she thought about in the early mornings, whether she had people who worried about her, whether anyone had ever matched her, and what had happened if they had. "What happens after you win this?" he asked. She turned to look at him. "I build what my father imagined," she said. "Irrigated land in this valley can support not just cattle but farming, real farming. I've been talking to families who want to settle and farm, families who can't afford the better established parcels further north. This land could give them something real." He had not expected that. He had expected her to describe a business plan, a revenue model, the kind of language he used himself. Instead, she had described people. "That's why you've been fighting so hard," he said. "That's part of it," she said. "The other part is that no one tells me I can't." He laughed, genuinely, a sound that surprised them both. She looked at him with those green eyes, and something in them had opened slightly, as if his laughter had moved something loose. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just that Fitch was right. You are headstrong." "He meant it as a warning," she said. "I know," Timothy said. "I took it as a recommendation." She held his gaze for 3 full seconds, and in those 3 seconds something shifted between them that was irrevocable in the quiet, permanent way of things that have been decided at a level deeper than conversation. Then she turned back to the land and said, practical as ever, "I need to show you where the second spring access point is. It's relevant to our water rights argument." He followed her, and they spent another hour walking the land while she explained its geography and history and possibilities, and he listened with the full weight of his attention. And when they rode back toward Laredo in the early afternoon, he was aware of a happiness that was low and steady and slightly alarming in its solidity, because in his experience, the things that felt most solid were also the things that hurt most to lose. He did not intend to lose this. The week that followed was one of motion and pressure, and the particular satisfaction of a well-executed strategy coming together piece by piece. Timothy worked through the legal angles while Maria managed the logistical elements of the hearing preparation, and together they met with 3 witnesses who could speak to the fraudulent nature of Croft's dealings and who were willing to do so on record. Croft, when confronted privately by Maria with the documented evidence, did not deny it. He was a small, apologetic man in his late 50s who had told himself a long story about how what he was doing was not really a betrayal, and who now had to look at the evidence of what it actually was. He resigned from the bank and agreed, in exchange for a reduced legal exposure, to provide a sworn statement documenting his arrangement with Brace. Brace himself was less accommodating. He hired 2 lawyers from San Antonio and filed a countermotion that was aggressive and somewhat inventive, and Timothy spent 2 days with Maria at her desk, working through the counterarguments with the focused intensity of people who know they are not wrong, but must prove they are not wrong to someone who has the power to decide otherwise. During those 2 days, the emotional temperature between them had been steadily climbing in the way of contained things, like a pressure building without a release valve, and on the second evening, when they had finally laid out a complete response to Brace's countermotion and the work was done, they sat back simultaneously and looked at each other across the desk, and the accumulated closeness of the past week was suddenly very present. "You're good at this," she said. "So are you," he said. "I've been doing it alone for 2 years," she said. "It's different with someone who actually keeps up." "I imagine it is," he said. "It's a particular kind of loneliness," she said, which was, he knew, a significant thing for her to say, the kind of thing she didn't say easily. "Doing something that requires all of you and having no one to share the load with." "I know that kind of loneliness," he said. She looked at him carefully. "Do you?" "I've been working alone for a long time," he said. "By choice, mostly. It's easier in some ways. No one to disagree with you. No one to tell you when you're wrong," she said. "You've been doing a thorough job of that," he said. She smiled at him, the full version this time, warm and unguarded, and it was so different from her usual contained expression that it stopped him entirely. He sat there looking at it and felt something happen in the center of his chest that was large and warm and slightly frightening. "Maria," he said. She heard the shift in his voice and her expression changed, not to wariness exactly, but to the careful attention of someone who knows that what is being said matters. "I'm going to say something," he said, "and I want you to know that I'm not saying it because of the work arrangement, and I'm not saying it because of the circumstances, which I recognize have been intense and tend to produce false closeness. I'm saying it because I have been working alongside you for a week and I know my own mind." She was very still. "I think you are one of the most extraordinary people I have ever met," he said. "I think I would like to keep knowing you long after this business is resolved, in whatever way you would permit." The silence was careful and aware. "You are saying this now," she said slowly, "when I have a court hearing in 3 weeks and a potential betrayal to process and a land dispute that is not yet resolved." "Yes," he said, "I'm aware of the timing. That is either very brave or very foolish," she said. "Could be both," he said, which was what she had said to him on the first night, and she recognized it, and the recognition moved something in her expression. "Timothy," she said. "Yes." "Ask me again after the hearing," she said. "When none of these other things are pressing on both of us, when we can see clearly what is real and what is circumstance." He nodded. "That's fair," he said, "more than fair." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read, and then she said quietly, "For what it's worth, I don't think it's only circumstance." He held that carefully, the way you hold something that matters. "Then I will ask you again after the hearing," he said. The December hearing was held in the Laredo courthouse, a square stone building that smelled of paper and dust and the particular authoritative odor of official proceedings. The judge was a man named Hargrove, who was known to be thorough if not particularly warm, and who had indeed ruled against easement claims twice in the recent past, which was why Timothy had prepared the secondary argument so carefully. Brace's lawyers were competent, and they made their arguments with the polished efficiency of men who had argued similar cases many times. But they were arguing a position that was fundamentally compromised by the documented evidence of Croft's fraudulent dealings, and no amount of legal polish could entirely conceal that. Timothy presented their case with the calm precision that came from absolute preparation, and Maria sat beside him at the counsel table with her files organized, and her expression composed and her presence so steady and focused that he could feel it beside him like something solid to lean against, though neither of them was leaning. When Croft's sworn statement was entered into evidence, there was a shift in the room, the particular quality of silence that means something significant has just changed. Brace, sitting at his own table, went very still. Judge Hargrove recessed for 2 hours. When he returned, his ruling was methodical. He found that Brace's competing claim had been advanced through a process of fraudulent collusion with a fiduciary agent of the original claimant, which constituted a material interference with the legal process and rendered the competing claim void. He upheld Maria Quinn's original filing. He ordered costs against Brace. He further indicated that the fraudulent conduct documented in the case was being referred to the district attorney's office for potential criminal proceedings. It was a complete resolution. Every claim Maria had fought for over 2 years was upheld. The water rights were hers. The land was hers. The path to everything her father had imagined and everything she had planned beyond that was clear. They stood outside the courthouse in the December noon sun, and Maria Quinn stood very straight with her face turned up slightly to the light, and Timothy watched her absorb the reality of what had just happened. 2 years of fighting and 10 years of her father's dream, all of it resolved and certain now. She breathed out slowly. Then she turned to Timothy Whitaker and looked at him with those green eyes and said, "Ask me now." He held her gaze. "I told you I would ask you after the hearing. The hearing is over." "Yes, it is," he said. The December sun was warm on the stone steps of the courthouse. A wagon passed on the street behind them. Somewhere down the block, a horse was objecting to something and being told to stop by a patient voice. "Maria Quinn," he said, "I would like very much to know you beyond the circumstances that brought us here. I would like to spend more time in your company, with the specific intention of seeing where that leads if you are willing." She was quiet for a moment, and in that moment he saw the full complexity of her, the woman who had learned not to need anyone, who had built her walls carefully out of necessity and lived inside them competently, and who was now looking at the gap in the wall that the last 3 weeks had made and deciding whether to step through it. "I am willing," she said, "with the understanding that I am still the person Fitch described." "Headstrong and costly," he said. "Exactly as advertised," she said. "Maria," he said, "I am counting on it." She stepped forward and put her hand in his, not in the businesslike grip of their first handshake, but in the open, deliberate way of something that meant more than that. He closed his hand around hers. The weeks that followed the hearing were a new kind of time, different from the intense compressed pressure of the legal work, and different from the years of solo labor that had preceded it for both of them. They were the weeks in which Timothy Whitaker and Maria Quinn began the slow, careful, deeply interesting process of learning each other as people rather than as colleagues. He did not leave Laredo. He told himself initially that he was staying to help Maria with the post-hearing paperwork and the initial plans for the land development, which was partly true. The fuller truth was that he had no compelling reason to be anywhere else, and a very compelling reason to be here. And he was an honest enough man to acknowledge that. They rode together most mornings, out to the land or through the surrounding country, because both of them were people who thought more clearly on horseback, and because the wide South Texas landscape gave their conversations a kind of openness that the desk and the papers and the filed documents did not. She told him about her father, Patrick Quinn, who had come from County Clare in Ireland in 1862, with nothing but a name and an absolute belief in the American land promise, and who had spent 20 years acquiring and losing and requiring parcels of Texas land with an obsessive tenacity that had been both his greatness and his ruin. He had died in 1879, leaving Maria, at 24, with the complicated legacy of 7 contested claims, a network of both allies and enemies, and a comprehensive education in land law that she had absorbed by necessity rather than choice, sitting beside him through meetings and readings and courthouse appearances from the time she was old enough to hold a pen. She had had a life before the land disputes, briefly. She had been engaged to be married at 22 to a man named Robert Calloway, a rancher's son from north of San Antonio, who had been kind and steady, and had not been able to fully grasp that she was not going to stop. Not going to stop fighting her father's fights, not going to stop learning the law, not going to become the particular kind of quiet that he needed from a wife. They had parted without hatred but with the mutual recognition of an irreconcilable difference. He wasn't wrong, she told Timothy on one of those morning rides, matter-of-factly, without self-pity. He needed something I wasn't able to be, and I needed something he wasn't able to give. What did you need? Timothy asked. She thought about it honestly. I needed someone who could keep up, she said, and who didn't want to slow me down. He absorbed this without comment, but inside he filed it alongside everything else he was learning about her and understood it exactly. He told her about himself in return, which did not come naturally to him, but came more naturally than it had with anyone else in recent memory. He told her about the years after the war, the hard practical education of a young man who had to become useful fast or starve. He told her about the cattle drives, the surveying work, the gradual shift into land negotiation. He told her about his mother, who had died in 1876, and his 2 brothers, one of whom had gone back east and one of whom was somewhere in New Mexico territory working a silver claim. He told her about the particular shape of a life built entirely on practicality and how that practicality, while it served him well, had left certain rooms in him unlit. She listened the way she did everything with the full weight of her attention, and when he finished she said, "You're lonely in the same specific way I am." "I told you that in your office," he said. "You told me you knew the kind," she said. "I'm telling you that you are the kind. There's a difference." He looked at her. The morning sun was behind her, and the brush country spread out on either side of them in its thorny, vivid endurance. She was looking at him with an expression that was direct and undefended, and he recognized in it exactly what she had named. "Yes," he said, "I am." She nodded as if something had been confirmed. They rode in comfortable silence for a while after that, the silence of 2 people who have said the necessary things and don't need to fill what follows with noise. Christmas came to Laredo with the particular mild pleasantness of a South Texas December, the air cool but not cold, the days short and bright. There were decorations in the storefronts along the main street, and the smell of pine from the wreaths people had hung on their doors, though the pine had come by wagon from considerably further north. Timothy had taken a room in the town's boarding house, a clean, no-nonsense establishment run by a widow named Mrs. Esperanza Garza, who had opinions about most things and expressed them freely, and who had, within 3 days of Timothy's arrival, formed a thorough assessment of the situation between him and Maria Quinn, which she shared with neither of them, but which was evident in the quality of her silence whenever his dinner arrived promptly and hot. Maria's house was on the western edge of town, a solid adobe structure that her father had built and that she had made her own with the accumulation of years, books and papers, and the particular personal atmosphere of someone who lived alone, but was not lonely in the miserable sense, only in the self-reliant sense. She invited him to dinner at her house for the first time in the week before Christmas. It was not elaborate. She was not a person who cooked for display, but it was good food. A beef stew with dried peppers and a cornbread that had clearly been made many times and perfected. And there was a bottle of a decent Madeira that she produced with the casual confidence of someone who knew good wine and didn't make a ceremony of it. They sat at her kitchen table while the small fire in her iron stove threw a warm, shifting light across the room, and they ate and talked, and the conversation moved easily through a dozen subjects: land and law and history, and the particular character of the country they were both living in. The way Texas in 1882 was still in the process of deciding what it was going to be. The cattle economy and the farming communities and the railroads changing the shape of everything faster than people could fully absorb. This whole territory is going to look different in 20 years, he said. It already looks different than it did 10 years ago, she said. My father used to say Texas was still writing its first chapter. What do you say? I say it's writing its second, she said, and that the people who survive to the third are the ones who can read and adapt. He looked at her across the table. The firelight was doing things to the shadow and color of the room, and she was very present in it, her dark hair loose now that the day was over, her green eyes alive with the particular animation that arguments and ideas produced in her. I would like to be here for the third chapter, he said. It was a statement with a double weight to it, and they both knew it. She set down her glass. Timothy, she said, I am not a woman who moves slowly when she knows her mind. I know that, he said. I know mine, she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand and laced her fingers through his with the directness that was entirely her. I love you, he said. It was not a planned declaration. It came out of the evening and the firelight and the accumulated truth of the past weeks, and it was so straightforward and certain that there was nothing theatrical about it, nothing frightened, only the clean, plain fact of the thing. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was open in a way he had rarely seen from her, stripped of the professional precision and the strategic calculation and the hard-won self-sufficiency, and what was underneath was something warm and certain and real. I love you too, she said, which is frankly inconvenient given everything else I have to manage. He laughed, that genuine sound again, and she smiled at him with the full warmth that she didn't often show. And the room was very warm and very quiet, and outside, the Texas night was cold and vast and not relevant at all. He stayed until late, and when he left he kissed her at the door, her hand on the frame and his hand on her face, a kiss that was unhurried and intentional and tasted of the evening's wine, and the particular warmth of a thing finally arrived at. Walking back through the cool December streets of Laredo, he was aware of a happiness so complete and solid that it was almost alarming. He had not known he was missing something this specific. He had known he was missing something. January of 1883 brought the work of actually beginning what Maria had planned for the land. Timothy threw himself into it alongside her with the same collaborative intensity that had characterized the legal preparation, and what emerged between them was something that worked on every level simultaneously, the professional and the personal and the practical all of a piece. They hired a surveyor and an engineer to assess the water infrastructure requirements. They met with the farming families that Maria had been talking to, 3 families in January, 2 more by March, people who had come west with the specific dream of farming and who needed the combination of affordable land and reliable water that Maria's valley could provide. She was generous in a way that was also practical, offering terms that gave families genuine ownership stakes and tied her own returns to the success of the crops, because she understood that her long-term interest and their long-term success were the same thing. Timothy watched her in these meetings and fell more deeply in love with her in a way that was specific and grounded. This was not infatuation, which was something he had felt before and which burned bright and fast. This was the other kind, the one that built on knowledge rather than mystery, on respect rather than projection, on the actual person rather than the idea of her. He proposed to her in March, on the land, where they had ridden out on a Sunday morning when the South Texas spring was beginning to show in the wildflowers that pushed up through the hard soil in obstinate yellow and purple abundance. He had not planned an elaborate scene. He had a ring that he had ridden to San Antonio the previous week to acquire, a simple band with a small emerald that had made him think immediately of her eyes. He had the ring in his pocket, and the right moment had not yet announced itself. And then they were standing at the convergence point of the three water sources, where the engineering work had already begun, and where the valley was starting to show what it would be. And she was describing what the first irrigation channel would look like, and he was listening. And the morning sun was on everything, and it came to him with absolute clarity that this was exactly where and when, and there was nothing to wait for. "Maria," he said. She stopped mid-sentence and looked at him, reading his face immediately. She was very good at reading his face now. He took the ring out of his pocket. She looked at it and then at him, and he saw the thing he had learned to recognize, that brief internal rearrangement, the headstrong, capable, independent woman arriving at the moment of being asked to be something more and deciding yes. "Maria Quinn," he said, "I would like to spend the rest of my life keeping up with you." She took the ring from his hand and looked at it closely, tilting it in the morning light. "You got an emerald," she said. "Your eyes," he said simply. She looked up at him, and her face was entirely undefended, all warmth and certainty, and the kind of happiness that doesn't announce itself loudly but sits deep and still. "Yes," she said. "Timothy Whitaker, yes." He put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it on her hand for a moment. And then she stepped into him, and he held her with both arms, and they stood there in the beginning of the valley they were building together, with the spring light on everything, and the smell of the warming earth, and the distant sound of the new irrigation work starting up. And it was perfect in the specific way of moments that are exactly what they should be. They were married in May of 1883 in the small Catholic church in Laredo, because Maria was her father's daughter and Patrick Quinn had been a church man, whatever else he was. Timothy was not particularly religious, but he was absolutely willing. And the priest, Father Mendez, who had known Maria since she was a child and who had a quiet amusement about the particulars of her character, performed the ceremony with warmth and brevity that both of them appreciated. The settlement that was forming in the valley sent 3 families to the wedding, which was also attended by Gerald Fitch, who had come down from San Antonio looking pleased with himself in a way that was both deserved and slightly smug. Mrs. Garza from the boarding house was there and wept at the appropriate moments. Santos, Maria's land manager, who had proved entirely loyal throughout the whole affair, stood in the front row with his hat in his hands, and his face carrying the particular dignified emotion of a man who has watched something good come about. Harlan Brace was not there, being occupied with the legal consequences of the court's referral to the district attorney. His situation was considerably diminished, and while Timothy held no particular personal satisfaction in another man's ruin, he was aware that some consequences were the direct result of some choices, and that the absence of injustice was a form of justice in itself. Alderman Croft had left Laredo. Where he had gone was not generally known. Maria had sat with the hurt of that betrayal in the months after the hearing, had worked through it with the same directness she brought to everything, and had arrived at a place that was not forgiveness exactly, but was a functional release. The decision to stop letting his choices use up her energy. Timothy had watched that process with respect and had not tried to manage it or rush it. The wedding dinner was held in the Garza boarding house dining room, which was the largest private space in town available for such things, and it was good and warm and full of the particular ease of people who are genuinely happy for the 2 people at the center of the table. Timothy stood at the end of the evening with his wife beside him, that word new and extraordinary in his mind, and looked around the room at these people who had become, in the space of 7 months, the texture of his life here, and felt something that he recognized after a moment as belonging. He had not belonged anywhere for a very long time. Maria took his hand under the table, and he looked at her, and she was looking at him with those green eyes and a small, private smile. "All right," she said quietly. "Considerably better than all right," he said. She squeezed his hand and turned back to the conversation around the table, and he sat beside her, and thought that Fitch had said she was headstrong and costly, and he had said that sounded like his kind of woman. And here, on the other side of all of it, with the evidence of everything those months had been, he would have said the same thing again, except with a great deal more knowledge of exactly what he was saying. The summer and fall of 1883 were years of building. The irrigation infrastructure in the valley was completed in June, the main channel dug, and lined with the stone that Timothy had sourced from a quarry 40 miles north, the secondary channels following through August. By September, the first families were farming real crops on their parcels, and Maria stood at the edge of the first planted field in October and watched the early growth with an expression that Timothy recognized as the private completion of something that had been a long time coming. "Your father would have liked to see this," he said. "He would have had 17 opinions about how it should have been done differently," she said, and smiled at the memory. "And then he would have been proud," Timothy said. "And then he would have been proud," she agreed. They were living in her house, which was no longer quite large enough, and in the late fall they began extending it, Timothy doing a substantial amount of the labor himself because he liked physical work, and because building something with his own hands for his own home had a satisfaction that was different from everything else. Maria was involved in every design decision, which meant the conversations were lengthy and occasionally spirited, but the results were exactly right. A new room with large windows on the south side, a second bedroom that was designated with a particular mutual understanding that they did not say aloud immediately but which was present between them. In November, Maria told him she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen in the early morning, matter-of-factly, the way she did most things, but he saw under the matter-of-fact surface the thing she was managing, the enormity of it, the joy and the fear, and the particular weight of a new life approaching. He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against him, which was something she did now, this woman who had been entirely self-contained, and that leaning was one of the most intimate things he had ever experienced. "Good," he said simply. "Good," she said back, and laughed a little shaky and warm. The pregnancy was not easy in the first months. She was sick in the mornings with a determined persistence that she resented intensely, and managed with her characteristic stubbornness, refusing to stop working for more than an hour and emerging pale-faced from those hours with her jaw set and her papers in hand. Timothy was careful not to hover because hovering would have produced a response he was not interested in receiving, but he was present and practical, ensuring there was food she could manage and water always close, and that her workload during the worst of it was quietly redistributed without her having to ask. She noticed all of it. "You are very good at helping in ways that don't feel like being helped," she told him one evening. "I've had good training," he said. "From whom?" she asked, curious. "From you," he said. "You have a very specific tolerance for assistance and a very clear signal when it's crossed, and I've been paying attention." She looked at him steadily. "You are, honestly, the most useful person I have ever met." "That is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me," he said. "Do not push your luck," she said, but she was smiling. The new year of 1884 came and the valley settlement was growing. 2 more families had arrived in December, and the community that was forming had the self-organizing energy of people who needed things and were building the ways to get them. There was a small school by February, run by a young woman named Clara Morales who had come from San Antonio with 2 years of teaching experience and a determination to stay. There was a trading post, run by one of the original farming families. There were the early conversations about a proper well and a community gathering space. Maria was the engine behind most of this, and she was doing it while visibly pregnant, which generated comment from people who expected her to be resting, and which she received with a politeness that Timothy privately found hilarious. "Mrs. Alvarez told me again today that I should be taking my ease," she reported one evening. "What did you tell her?" I told her I would take my ease in July when the irrigation expansion was complete, she said. And she said, she made a noise that I think was disapproval but might have been respect, Maria said. With Mrs. Alvarez it can be hard to tell. He laughed. She had developed, in the months of building this community, a dry humor about the community itself that he loved, a humor that came from genuine affection and the comfortable distance of someone who understood that people in groups were both necessary and deeply human in all their imperfection. Their son was born in June of 1884, on a night when the summer heat was bearing down on Laredo with its full weight, and the house was too warm and Maria was entirely done with being patient. She had labored for 8 hours with the gritted competence of a woman who approached all challenges that way, and Timothy had been beside her for every one of those hours in the way that the midwife, a formidable woman named Dolers, had instructed him, which was to be present and quiet and useful, and to keep his opinions about the process to himself. When the baby arrived, Timothy held his son for the first time and felt something happen in him that was entirely new. A large and helpless and absolute love for this small and furious person who had Patrick Quinn's stubborn set to his jaw already. Or so Timothy imagined, looking at the newborn face in the lamplight. They named him Patrick James Whitaker, Patrick for Maria's father and James for Timothy's, and the names together felt like the right bridge between the two histories that were now one. Maria held him afterward, exhausted and certain and radiant in the specific way of a woman who has just done something enormous, and Timothy sat on the edge of the bed and watched her look at their son with an expression that was more undefended than any he had ever seen from her, the armor entirely down, nothing but this extraordinary open love. "He has your nose," she said without looking up. "He has your jaw," Timothy said. "God help him," she said, and the warmth in her voice was bottomless. The fall of 1884 brought a new challenge that neither of them had fully anticipated. The success of the Valley settlement had drawn attention, and not all of it welcome. A land syndicate based in Austin had identified the water rights situation in the Laredo Valley as an opportunity, and had sent a representative to make an offer for Maria's central parcel that was, on the surface, substantial. The representative was a smooth, confident man named Caldwell who wore Eastern clothes and spoke with the particular ease of someone accustomed to being received well. He came to their house on a Tuesday afternoon and made his offer over coffee with the professional affability of a man who expected to be negotiating by the end of the conversation. Maria heard him out completely. She sat across from him with Patrick on her lap, 9 months old and deeply interested in the buttons on her coat, and she listened to the offer with her face composed and her eyes thoughtful. Timothy sat beside her and said nothing, because this was her call and he knew it, and she knew he knew it. When Caldwell finished his presentation, Maria shifted Patrick to a more comfortable position against her shoulder and said, "No." Caldwell blinked. "Mrs. Whitaker, the offer is quite—" "I heard the offer," she said pleasantly. "It's a fair price for the land considered as a raw asset. It's not a remotely adequate offer for what the land is now, which is the foundation of a working community. And the syndicate you represent has a specific history of acquiring water rights and restricting access to create a monopoly on surrounding development, which I have read about in the records from 2 other counties. So no. But thank you for the trip." Caldwell left with considerably less ease than he had arrived with. Timothy waited until the door closed. "You read about the syndicate last week," she said, "when I heard they were coming. I wrote to the county clerk in Travis County." He looked at her. Patrick was now attempting to eat her collar. "You never stop," he said. "Did you want me to?" she said, looking at him. "Absolutely not," he said. It was an admiring observation. She handed him the baby and stood up to clear the coffee cups, and he sat with his son and thought that this was what life looked like when you chose the right person. Not an easier life but a fuller one, a life in which all the rooms were lit. The syndicate made 2 more attempts over the following months, the second through a legal challenge to the water rights structure that Timothy handled with the thoroughness it deserved, and by early 1885 they had given up and turned their attention elsewhere. The valley settlement, now called Quinn's Crossing by its inhabitants, which had not been Maria's idea but which she had accepted with a combination of embarrassment and quiet pride, was firmly established and growing. The school had expanded. The trading post had a second building. A small church was under construction, Father Mendez coming out from Laredo to oversee the design and to express opinions about the placement of the windows. There were 14 farming families and 2 cattle operations that used the valley's grazing land in the way Maria had negotiated seasonal access in exchange for a portion of the market proceeds that went into a community fund. It was not perfect. There were disputes between neighbors about land boundaries and about the allocation of water during dry weeks, and Maria was frequently in the middle of these, not as a mediator exactly, but as the person with the knowledge and the standing to propose solutions that people could actually agree to. It was exhausting work, and she did it with the same focused intelligence she brought to everything, and with a patience that surprised Timothy slightly, because patience was not the first quality he associated with her. "You're different with these people than I expected," he told her one evening, coming in from the valley where he had spent the afternoon on the new Eastern Channel expansion. "Different how?" she asked, looking up from Patrick, who was learning to walk with the concentrated determination of someone who has been told it's difficult and has taken this as a challenge. "Patient," he said, "with the disputes, with the Alvarez family and their boundary argument." She thought about this. "They are building something real," she said finally. "They left the places they came from and they put down roots here and they are trying to make it work. I can afford them patience. They've earned it." He watched her watch their son take 3 careful steps and then sit down hard and look at the floor with an expression of profound assessment. "You're going to be magnificent at this," he said. "At what?" "At all of it," he said. "All of this." She looked at him across the room with those green eyes and the expression that was warm and direct and completely hers. "We are going to be magnificent at all of this," she said, with the particular emphasis on the first word that made it a correction and a declaration simultaneously. He crossed the room and kissed her, and Patrick, from the floor, made a noise of commentary that could have been approval. The spring of 1886 brought news from San Antonio that Gerald Fitch, the small lawyer with the worried mouse face who had sent Timothy to Laredo in the first place, had suffered a financial reversal of the kind that happened to small lawyers who overextended themselves in ambitious real estate arrangements. He was not destitute, but he was considerably reduced. Timothy wrote him a letter describing a potential consulting arrangement, because Fitch knew Texas land law extremely well, and because Quinn's Crossing was at a point where a reliable legal consultant with expertise in land matters was a practical necessity. Fitch replied within a week with the kind of enthusiastic gratitude that suggested this had arrived at an extremely good moment. Fitch came to Quinn's Crossing in April, traveling by rail to Laredo and then by wagon the remaining distance, and he arrived looking somewhat bedraggled but essentially himself, small and alert and possessed of his characteristic quality of finding everything around him professionally fascinating. He stayed for a month the first time, and was useful in the exact ways Timothy had hoped. Maria worked with him on 3 outstanding land filings and 2 water rights questions from neighboring properties, and Fitch, who had heard her described as headstrong and costly, and who had described her that way himself, was in person entirely won over by her within 2 days of working alongside her. "You told me she was difficult," Fitch said to Timothy privately, with the tone of a man who has been agreeably surprised. "I told you Fitch described her that way," Timothy said. "I told you that sounded like my kind of woman," Fitch smiled slowly. "And so it proved." "And so it proved," Timothy agreed. Maria, when told about this exchange later, said, "Headstrong means you know your mind. Costly means you have standards." And Timothy said, "That's almost exactly what I said to you in the saloon." And she said, "I know. You've always understood it correctly." Their daughter was born in September of 1886, a girl with Maria's dark hair and Timothy's gray eyes, who arrived in the world at 4 in the morning with an urgency that suggested she had been waiting for an opportunity and had taken it. They named her Catherine Nora Whitaker, Catherine for Timothy's mother and Nora for Maria's grandmother. And Patrick, who was 2 years old and had opinions about most things, regarded his new sister with a wary respect that was quite endearing in someone of his age. The family they were making had a texture to it that Timothy found constantly remarkable, because he had not known what family felt like from the inside of one he had built himself. His own childhood family had been survival, which was a different thing. This was something you built forward rather than held together, and the difference was in the direction of it. Maria was extraordinary as a mother in the specific way that she was extraordinary at everything. Not soft in the conventional sense, but deeply present, deeply interested in the actual people her children were becoming rather than the people she might have preferred them to be. Patrick at 2 was already showing the particular stubborn intelligence that was going to make his life interesting, and she encouraged it with a patience that Timothy recognized as love made practical. Catherine was, from very early, a different kind of person, observant and quiet, and with an enormous capacity for stillness that made her seem older than she was. She watched the world with those gray eyes, and Timothy found himself talking to her, from the time she was an infant, as if she understood more than she let on, which turned out, as she grew, to have been correct. The settlement of Quinn's Crossing continued to grow through the late 1880s. The railroad came through Laredo in 1887, and the access it created changed the economics of farming in the valley profoundly and quickly. Crops that had previously been sold locally could now reach San Antonio and beyond, and the families who had come with small means and large determination found themselves, in many cases, substantially more solvent than they had been when they arrived. Maria had structured the original land arrangements with a long-term view, and the specific way she had done it meant that, as the surrounding property values rose, the farming families held equity in their own parcels rather than being tenants who could be priced out. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate decision that had generated pushback at the time from people who thought she was being financially foolish, and it turned out to have been exactly right. Timothy had argued for it alongside her at the time, because he had seen the same long-term picture she had, and because their thinking had by that point so thoroughly cross-referenced that they often arrived at the same conclusions by different routes, and found this mutually confirming. In 1888, a newspaper in San Antonio ran a piece about the Quinn's Crossing settlement as an example of successful land development in South Texas, and the article mentioned Maria by name in a way that was admiring and slightly surprised, in the way that articles about women in 1888 tended to be admiring and slightly surprised when they described competence. Maria read the article and set it aside with the expression of someone who has been told something she already knew presented as if it were remarkable. "They describe you as unusual," Timothy said. "I know," she said. "Does it bother you?" She considered. "It bothers me that it's considered unusual," she said. "That there aren't 10 other women in 10 other valleys doing the same thing, because there should be. The resources and the knowledge and the determination exist. The obstacles are the parts that are constructed." "You could write about that," he said. She looked at him. "Could I?" "You know land law better than most lawyers in this state," he said. "You have a documented case study of a model that works. You could write about what you built and how you built it. Other people would read it." She looked at the article on the table and then at the window and then at him. "That would take time I don't currently have," she said. "You could make the time," he said. "I can cover more of the day-to-day through next year if that's what the time requires." "Why would you do that?" He looked at her steadily. "Because you are worth the investment," he said, "and because I think you have things to say that deserve to be said." She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up the article and folded it and set it on the corner of her desk in a way that meant it had been filed under pending rather than discarded. She did write it. It took her 18 months, worked on in the early mornings before the house was fully awake, and Timothy covered more of the daily operational management of the settlement through that time without complaint and with genuine interest, because the settlement was as much his as it was hers by now. The piece she produced was not sentimental. It was practical and specific, a detailed account of the land strategy, the legal structure, the community economics, and the water infrastructure, written in the clear, direct prose of someone who respected their readers' intelligence and was not interested in being interesting at the expense of being correct. It was published in the spring of 1890 in a legal and land journal out of Austin, and it generated more response than either of them had expected. Letters from lawyers and land developers, and from several women in other parts of Texas who wrote to say they had read it 3 times and then sent it to other people. Maria received these letters with a composure that Timothy recognized as moved, which was a rarer and more precise thing than pleased. The spring of 1890 brought one more piece of unfinished business that had to be addressed before the story of what they had built could be fully complete, and that was the situation with Harlan Brace. Brace had been convicted in 1884 on a charge of fraudulent interference in a legal proceeding, a lesser charge than might have been brought, but the one that the district attorney had been able to prove conclusively. He had served 18 months in the Bexar County Jail and had emerged diminished in the specific way of men who had been too certain of their own untouchability. His cattle operation had been sold during his imprisonment, and he had relocated, it was generally understood, to somewhere in West Texas where his reputation was less established. He appeared in Laredo in March of 1890, which was itself an act that took a certain kind of nerve. He came to Maria directly, which took more. He was older, the meanness that had been in his eyes in 1882 replaced by something that looked more like exhaustion, and he came with his hat in his hand in the literal sense and asked to speak with her. Timothy was present. He stood back and let Maria lead. Brace said that he had spent 6 years thinking about the particular trap he had set for a woman who was trying to build something real, and about the kind of man who did such a thing, and about the kind of man he wanted to be in the years he had remaining. He said he had come not to ask anything, but to say that he had been wrong in a specific and deliberate way, and that he was aware of it. Maria listened to him with the focused attention she gave everything. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Brace," she said, "the harm you did was not only to me. It was to every family who might have had this land sooner if you had not interfered. Those are harms I can't undo and you can't repay. I don't expect you to." "No," he said, "I know. I also," she said, "don't intend to spend the rest of my life carrying the weight of what you did, so I will tell you this. What you set out to destroy exists and is thriving. If that is any part of the accounting you're doing, you can include it." He nodded. He looked at the window and then at the floor and then back at her. "I heard you call it Quinn's Crossing," he said. "The community named it that," she said. "I didn't choose it. Your father would have liked it," he said, which surprised both of them because it was the kind of thing only someone who had known Patrick Quinn would know to say. He left shortly after. Timothy watched him go and then looked at Maria. She was looking at the door with an expression that was, he thought, something like the particular weight lifting of the last small piece of something finally resolved. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said, and then, "He was right about my father." "I know," he said. She turned from the door and looked at him with those green eyes and the expression that he had learned over 7 years to read as completely as he had ever read anything. It was the expression of someone who is standing at the center of a life they built deliberately and who, in this moment, is aware of that. He crossed the room and she leaned into him in that way she had developed over the years, the leaning that still, every time, told him more than words. They stood like that in the quiet of the office for a moment, with the spring afternoon coming through the windows and the sounds of Quinn's crossing outside, the voices and the wagon wheels and the distant sound of the construction on the new community hall, all of it the evidence of what they had made. Patrick was 7 that spring, a compact, opinionated boy with his mother's jaw and his father's way of thinking through problems from multiple angles, who was in the new settlement school and was already the teacher's most engaging challenge. Catherine was 4, still the watcher, still the still one, with a quality of thought that made her seem in some rooms the oldest person present. They were, Timothy thought frequently, 2 completely specific people who happened to have arrived in the world through him and the woman he loved, and they were endlessly interesting. By 1891, Quinn's Crossing had a permanent population of over 200 people and was on the county map as an official settlement. The irrigation system had been extended twice. The school had 2 teachers. The church was finished, and Father Mendez came out from Laredo twice a month and sometimes stayed. There was a doctor, a young man named William Reyes, who had trained in Galveston and who had come to Quinn's Crossing because Maria had written him a letter describing the medical needs of a growing rural community in a way that he had found difficult to refuse. Timothy had taken on a formal role in the county land office as a special consultant on water rights, a role that came with a modest official salary and a significant amount of influence over the kind of disputes that affected communities like Quinn's Crossing. He used that influence carefully and consistently in the direction of the people who had least power in the system, the farming families and the small ranchers whose access to water determined whether they survived or failed. He and Maria still rode together most mornings when the day permitted it, because some habits had formed early and remained. On a morning in the spring of 1892, 10 years after Timothy Whitaker had ridden into Laredo on Gerald Fitch's description of a woman who was headstrong and costly, they rode out to the valley as they still did, through the brush country that was the same as it had always been and entirely different because of what had been built in it. The valley was green now in the spring, genuinely green in the way of irrigated land, the fields showing the early growth of the planted crops and the cottonwoods along the channel taller and fuller than they had been when the first channel was dug. The settlement was visible from the ridge, the cluster of buildings and the patterns of the fields, the ordered productivity of a community that was working because the people in it had been given what they needed and had done the rest themselves. Maria stopped her horse on the ridge and looked down at it, as she sometimes did, with the expression of someone doing a private accounting. "It looks like something that was always going to be here," she said. "It does," he agreed. "My father imagined something," she said. "I built a version of it that he didn't imagine, and it's better than what he imagined." "Because you knew more than he did," Timothy said. "Because we built it together," she said, and looked at him sideways with those green eyes. He looked back at her, this woman who was 10 years deeper into his life than the first night in the saloon, and who was at the same time every day something new and specific to know, and thought that Fitch had told him she was headstrong and costly, and he had said that sounded like his kind of woman, and the underestimation in those words was now visible to him in a way it hadn't been then, because headstrong and costly were the smallest part of what she was. She was the kind of woman who built valleys. The kind who wrote articles that changed how people thought about things. The kind who raised children who were distinctly themselves. The kind who looked at a betrayal and worked through it and came out the other side without letting it close her. The kind who leaned against you in the quiet of early mornings when the world was still deciding what it was going to be. She was his kind of woman in every way that the phrase could hold. He reached across the space between their horses, and she took his hand with the directness that had always been completely hers, and they sat there on the ridge above Quinn's Crossing in the spring morning, holding hands like they were 22 and new to each other, because some things were true at the beginning and remained true through every year of living, and love between 2 people who were genuinely matched was one of them. "Come on," she said. "I need to look at the Eastern Channel before the irrigation meeting at noon." "Of course you do," he said. She rode down from the ridge, and he rode after her into the green and growing valley, and the morning was wide and warm, and full of the particular irreplaceable richness of a life in which everything worth having had been won deliberately and held well. Their third child arrived in the fall of 1893, a boy they named James Thomas Whitaker, who had red hair from somewhere in the Quinn family lineage, and who announced himself from the first day as a person of significant energy and firm opinions. Patrick, at 9, regarded his new brother with the slightly weary air of a boy who had been the oldest, and understood that this status came with responsibilities. Catherine, at 7, was fascinated and gentle, and spent long hours beside the cradle in quiet observation that was entirely characteristic. The Whitaker family, by the close of 1893, was full and complex and alive in every room of the house that Timothy had extended twice, and that Maria had organized into an efficient and warm space that was the center of a life neither of them had quite imagined at its beginning. On a December evening of that year, with the children in bed and the fire low in the stove and the quiet that settled over the house after the full noise days, Maria sat reading at one end of the kitchen table, and Timothy sat writing correspondence at the other end, and the domestic piece of it was so complete that he paused in his writing and simply sat for a moment in the awareness of it. She looked up from her book and found him looking at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Only that I'm very glad Fitch sent me to Laredo." She set her book on the table. "I'm very glad you came," she said, which was, from Maria Quinn Whitaker, a declaration of considerable depth. "I knew from the first moment in that saloon," he said. "You knew I was worth the risk," she said. "I knew you were the kind of person who made the risk irrelevant," he said. She looked at him for a long moment across the kitchen table, with the firelight and the quiet and the distant sound of one of the children turning in sleep. Her eyes were exactly the color of the emerald in the ring she had worn for 10 years. She stood up and crossed to him and sat on the bench beside him and leaned her head against his shoulder, which she did sometimes in the evenings when the day was fully done. He put his arm around her. The fire settled in the stove. Outside, the December dark was deep and cold and enormous, the way of Texas winter nights, and inside the house was warm and full and completely their own, built over 10 years of fighting for things worth fighting for and choosing each other at every crossroads and building forward always into the life that was still, even now, opening in front of them. "Headstrong and costly," he said quietly, "with everything in it. And worth every bit of it," she said. "Every single bit," he agreed. And in the quiet of their house at the edge of the valley they had built together, Timothy Whitaker held his wife close and felt the full specific weight of a life chosen well. And there was nothing left unresolved, nothing left in shadow, nothing worth the name of ending that had not been met and answered. Only the good forward motion of two people who had found each other when the finding was hard, and had held on through everything that followed, and had made of it something real and lasting and complete.